She was 20 years old, standing at a crossroads outside Sable Creek, Wyoming Territory, with $11 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and nowhere on this earth that she could call home. Her uncle, Silas Mabry, had put her out of the only house she'd ever known, telling the neighbors she was ungrateful and too proud to earn her keep, when the truth was simpler and colder. He wanted the land free of her so he could sell it whole. She had her father's coat, her mother's Bible, and a red-coated cattle dog named Copper trotting at her heel, the only creature left who still looked at her like she mattered. With 4 of those $11, she would soon buy a crumbling, forgotten telegraph station that the county couldn't even give away. A building so far gone that men laughed when she raised her hand at the auction. It was a foolish thing to do, but sealed inside those rotting walls was something that would not only change her life, it would set right a wrong that had been quietly poisoning her town for 3 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Mabry and her faithful dog Copper. If a story like this warms something in you, tell us where you're watching from tonight, and let it settle a little longer before you go. Clara had been born in the spring of 1868, in a clapboard house at the edge of the Wyoming grasslands, the only child of Thomas and Ruth Mabry, and from her earliest memory, the sound of her father's telegraph key clicking through the night had been as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Thomas Mabry had operated the depot at Bitter Root Station, back when the rail spur still ran through Sable Creek, back when the town was young and hopeful, and the telegraph wire humming overhead seemed to promise that the whole wide world was only a few dots and dashes away. Ruth had died of a fever when Clara was 6, and rather than send his daughter off to relatives, Thomas had kept her close, teaching her to read the code the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, patiently, repeatedly, with the quiet insistence that this was a skill worth having. Clara remembered sitting on an overturned crate beside her father's desk, her small hand resting on his larger one as he pressed the key, learning that a single dot could mean the difference between a message understood and a message lost. "Listen first," he used to tell her. "Everybody wants to talk. Not many want to listen. You listen first, and you'll always know more than the man across from you." It was her father who brought Copper into her life, a squirming red-brown pup with one white paw that he'd taken in payment from a rancher who couldn't afford the telegraph fee to wire his daughter's wedding announcement east. Clara was 11 that year, and she named the pup for the color of his coat, the same burnished copper as the wire that ran along the poles outside the station. From that first winter, the dog slept at the foot of her bed, and by the time she was 14, he understood the rhythm of her days better than she did herself, waking her before dawn, following her to the well, lying beneath her father's desk, while the key clicked long into the evening. There was a particular tenderness in how the dog watched her, an attentiveness that Clara had come to depend on, without ever quite naming it, and when her father sat by the stove some nights, and said that a good dog was a kind of promise, that somebody in this world had decided to stay, Clara had believed him completely. Clara's mother, before her death, had been known in Sable Creek as a woman with a gift for mending what others called ruined, taking in torn quilts and broken harness leather and returning them sound, and she had told Clara once, in the last winter of her life, that there was no shame in a thing looking used so long as it still worked. A lesson Clara carried forward long after she'd lost the woman who first spoke it. Thomas Mabry, grieving in his own quiet way, leaned on that same philosophy without ever naming it as his late wife's, keeping the depot's aging equipment running years past when a lesser man would have requisitioned new, patching brass fittings and rewinding coils by lamplight, rather than admit that anything under his care could not be salvaged. Clara absorbed this without being taught it directly, the way children absorb the shape of a household's values simply by living inside them, and by the time she was old enough to help her father formally with the station's bookkeeping, she had already come to believe, as a matter of plain fact, rather than sentiment, that value and appearance were two entirely different things, and that the second was a poor guide to the first. The rail line through Sable Creek was rerouted in 1883, when Clara was 15, after a flood took out a trestle bridge 12 miles east, and the railroad decided it was cheaper to lay new track through the valley than repair the old. Overnight, Bitterroot Station became a relic, its telegraph wire silenced, its platform given over to weeds. Thomas Mabry lost his post, and, with it, the small but steady income that had kept their family fed. He took to farming a modest plot outside town, the same plot his own father had once worked, and Clara grew up learning the discipline of soil, instead of the discipline of the code, though she never let the telegraph key her father kept in an oiled cloth in his trunk gather dust. She practiced on it some evenings, simply because it felt like keeping a promise to something. Thomas often said that the world changed its mind about what was valuable, more often than people liked to admit, and that a skill, once learned honestly, was never truly wasted. Clara held on to that, the way she held on to Copper's collar on cold mornings, a thing to steady her hand. Her father died of a lung fever in the winter of 1886, when Clara was 18, and it was in the weeks after his death that she first noticed a change in her Uncle Silas, her father's younger brother, who arrived from Cheyenne ostensibly to help settle the estate and never quite left. Silas Mabry was a narrow, watchful man who spoke softly and smiled often, and it took Clara the better part of 2 years to understand that his gentleness was a kind of currency he spent carefully, only when spending it got him something. He took over the running of the farm until Clara was settled. A phrase that grew more elastic with each passing season, and though Clara worked the land as hard as any hired man, doing the milking, the mending, the planting, Silas made it plain in 100 small ways that he considered her a guest in her own father's house. Copper, for his part, had never once warmed to Silas, and would rise stiff-legged and low-growling whenever the man came too near Clara's side, an instinct Clara would later understand she ought to have trusted sooner than she did. By the spring of 1888, Silas had quietly arranged, through a lawyer in Cheyenne and a banker in Sable Creek named Elias Grant, to have the farm's deed transferred into his name, using a signature Clara had given without understanding, on a document Silas told her was merely a formality, so the taxes could be paid properly. She discovered the truth only when Silas informed her, without particular ceremony, over a supper of boiled potatoes, that he had found a buyer for the land, and that she would need to make other arrangements by the end of the month. When Clara protested that the farm was her father's, her inheritance, her home, Silas's gentle voice hardened into something she had not heard from him before, and he told her plainly that a young unmarried woman had no real use for 80 acres and a falling-down house, that she ought to be grateful he'd looked after things as long as he had, and that continued gratitude might see her placed with a respectable family in town as a housekeeper, if she behaved. Clara understood, in that moment, that she had already lost, and that the kindest thing left to her was to leave with her dignity, rather than beg for scraps of what had once been entirely hers. She packed what fit into a single canvas bag: her mother's Bible, a wool shawl, a tin of her father's oiled telegraph tools, and the $11 that represented the whole of her wages from 3 years of unpaid labor. Money Silas had reluctantly handed over more to be rid of her than out of any sense of fairness. Copper she did not have to pack. The dog simply fell into step beside her the moment she walked out the door, as though he had been waiting his whole life for the day she'd finally leave and take him properly with her. Neighbors watched her go with the particular embarrassed silence of people who suspected an injustice had occurred, but lacked the courage to name it. And Clara walked the 6 miles into Sable Creek with her chin level and her eyes dry, because she had promised herself, somewhere around the 2nd mile, that she would not give Silas Mabry the satisfaction of her tears. Sable Creek in the spring of 1888 was a town that had never quite recovered from the railroad's departure 5 years before. Storefronts stood half-occupied, the old hotel had shuttered its 2nd floor for want of guests, and the town's fortunes had come to depend heavily on the good graces of Elias Grant, who held the mortgage on nearly every business along Main Street, and had, in the years since the rail line moved, positioned himself as Sable Creek's sole benefactor, the man who kept the town afloat through hard winters with loans he was careful to remind people about at every opportunity. Clara had heard her father speak of Grant only once, not long before he died, in a tone she hadn't understood at the time, not quite suspicion, but something adjacent to it, a carefulness in his voice whenever the banker's name came up. She thought of that now, walking past Grant's brick bank building with its polished windows, though she had no reason yet to connect it to anything. It was outside the county courthouse, on the very afternoon of her arrival, that Clara found the notice pinned to the board. A tax auction, to be held that same hour, disposing of several parcels the county had given up collecting on, among them Bitterroot Station, and the quarter-acre of scrub it stood upon, back taxes and penalties amounting to more than the structure itself was worth. Clara had not planned to attend, but something about the words on that notice, her father's old station, the place where she had learned to listen before she learned to talk, pulled her feet toward the small crowd gathered at the courthouse steps. The auctioneer, a portly man named Barnaby Fitch, ran through the parcels quickly, most going for a few dollars to men interested only in the scrap value of the lumber, and when he came at last to Bitterroot Station, he barely lifted his voice, expecting no bids at all on a building most people in town considered an eyesore best left to collapse on its own. Clara raised her hand before she had fully decided to. $4, she said, and her voice did not shake, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she felt certain everyone could hear it. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the small crowd. A girl, alone, buying a ruin nobody else wanted. But no one else bid, because no one else wanted it. And Fitch brought his gavel down with the mild bemusement of a man who has seen stranger things, and expects to see stranger still. Clara paid her $4, was handed a deed with her own name written on it in a clerk's careless hand, and stood there a long moment with Copper leaning warm against her leg, feeling for the first time in weeks that something in the world, however small and broken, belonged entirely to her, and could not be taken away on anyone else's whim. She walked the mile and a half out to the old station that same evening, arriving as the sky went the color of a healing bruise, purples and oranges bleeding into the flat grassland, and stood before the building she had not properly seen since she was 15 years old. Bitterroot Station had once been a trim little depot with a covered platform and a bell that rang the trains in, but 5 years of neglect had stripped it down to its bones. The platform roof sagged, half the windows had lost their glass to weather, and boys with slingshots, and a family of barn swallows had taken up residence in the eaves. And yet standing in the doorway, breathing in the smell of dust and old cedar, and, faintly, of the machine oil her father used to keep his equipment running smooth, Clara felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since Silas had told her to leave. This building had been her father's kingdom once. It could, perhaps, become something of her own. She and Copper made their home in the station's single dry room that first week, Clara sweeping out years of dust and bird droppings, patching the worst of the window gaps with oiled canvas, and trading an afternoon of mending for a second-hand cook stove from a widow on the edge of town, who admired her grit more than she doubted her sense. It was hard, spare living, but it was hers, and there was a peculiar dignity in it that Clara had not expected to find in a building everyone else considered worthless. She began, almost without meaning to, restoring her father's old telegraph desk in the front room, oiling the key, dusting the sounder, running her fingers over the grain of the wood where his hands had rested for so many years, and it was there, on her fourth evening in the station, that Copper began to behave strangely. The dog had always been fond of that particular corner of the room, the one nearest the old pot-bellied stove, where a section of wainscoting ran floor to ceiling, but on this evening, he would not settle. He paced before the paneling, sniffed at the baseboard with an insistence Clara had rarely seen in him, and finally began to scratch at a seam in the wood so deliberately that Clara set down her rag and came to see what had caught his attention. She ran her hand along the panel, and felt, beneath years of grime, a hinge worked so cleverly into the joinery that it was nearly invisible to the eye, a craftsman's trick, meant to be found only by someone who knew to look, or by a dog whose nose had caught some scent no human sense could name. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, and Copper answered by pressing his nose flat against the seam, and giving a low urgent whine that was not quite a bark. The particular sound Clara had come to understand meant he had found something and needed her to hurry. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lamplight with a kitchen knife, and more patience than she knew she possessed, to work the hidden panel loose, and when it finally swung inward on hinges that shrieked with disuse, she found herself looking not at a closet or a cubby, but at a narrow room, no larger than a pantry, built into the thickness of the station's back wall, where no architect's drawing would ever have shown it. Copper pushed past her legs the moment the gap was wide enough, tail low and serious, and stood inside the little room as though guarding it, looking back at her with an expression she could only describe as expectant, as though he had been waiting his whole life to lead her to exactly this place. Inside, coated in dust that had clearly sat undisturbed for years, Clara found a small strongbox, a stack of ledgers bound in oilcloth, and, unmistakably, heartbreakingly, her father's second Telegraph journal, the private one he had always kept separate from his official station log, its leather cover worn soft from handling. Her hands trembled as she carried the journal to the lamp. The early pages were ordinary enough, notes on weather and wire maintenance and the small business of a working depot, but as she turned further in, the entries changed in character, becoming careful, coded, deliberately obscure in a way her father had never written before. He had used the telegraph shorthand he'd taught her as a girl, but layered with a private cipher of his own devising, substitutions and reversals that would mean nothing to a casual reader but that unlocked, letter by letter, beneath Clara's patient decoding over the following days, into something far more serious than farm notes. A record, kept in her father's own careful hand during his final year as station operator, detailing a series of telegraph transfers routed through Bitter Root Station, in the months after the Great Prairie Fire of 1882, when relief funds from as far as Chicago and Denver had been wired to Sable Creek to help rebuild the burned-out east side of town. Clara read late into 3 successive nights. Copper curled at her feet through all of them, occasionally lifting his head to watch her with the same steady attentiveness he'd shown leading her to the room, and slowly, the shape of what her father had uncovered became clear. The relief money, nearly $6,000, an almost unthinkable sum for a town the size of Sable Creek, had been wired through the telegraph office to be held at the bank pending distribution to families who'd lost homes and livestock in the fire. But her father's careful notation of wire timestamps, cross-referenced against the bank's public ledger of disbursements, which he had somehow obtained a copy of, showed a gap that could not be innocently explained. Nearly $4,000 of that relief money had never reached a single burned-out family. It had been logged as received by the bank, and then, through a series of transfers her father had traced letter by letter, quietly moved into accounts and land purchases that all led back, eventually, to Elias Grant. Clara understood, reading this by lamplight with her father's careful hand laid out before her, why Thomas Mabry had never spoken openly of what he suspected. A telegraph operator's authority rested entirely on the town's trust that he would keep private the messages that passed through his hands, and to accuse the most powerful man in Sable Creek of theft, based on inference and pattern rather than a confession, would have destroyed her father's reputation and livelihood long before it touched Grant's. He had done what a careful, patient man does. He had kept his evidence close, encoded against prying eyes, waiting perhaps for enough proof to make the accusation unassailable, or perhaps, simply unable to decide what to do with a truth so much larger than himself. And then the fever had taken him before he ever found his answer, and the secret had sat sealed in the wall of an abandoned station for 2 years, waiting for someone patient enough, and stubborn enough, to listen the way he'd always said mattered more than talking. Clara did not act rashly. She spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly cross-referencing her father's journal against what public records she could access at the courthouse, verifying dates, verifying names, confirming that the pattern he'd traced held together under scrutiny rather than crumbling into coincidence. And in that time she also began, in small ways, to become known in Sable Creek, not as Silas Mabry's cast-off niece, but as the young woman living out at the old telegraph station with her dog, mending harness leather and taking in sewing to keep herself fed, quiet and industrious and entirely her own person. It was during this time that word reached alias Grant, through channels Clara never fully identified, that Thomas Mabry's daughter had bought Bitterroot Station and was spending unusual hours poring over old papers by lamplight, and it was not long after that word reached her that the banker had begun asking pointed questions about what, exactly, she thought she had found. The pressure began gently, in the way Clara supposed such pressure always began. Grant's clerk arrived at the station one afternoon, with an offer to purchase the building outright for $50, a sum wildly disproportionate to what she'd paid, framed as an act of civic generosity toward a struggling young woman who surely had better prospects than a crumbling depot. Clara declined, politely, and the offer rose the following week to $100, still framed as kindness, still carrying beneath its surface the unmistakable urgency of a man who wanted something gone before it could be examined too closely. When declining twice did not produce the desired result, the tenor of the visits changed. 2 men Clara did not recognize rode out to the station one evening under the pretense of asking directions, and lingered long enough at the edge of her property that Copper's hackles rose and stayed raised, the dog planting himself squarely between Clara and the strangers, and holding a low continuous growl, until the men, unnerved, rode on. Clara understood the visit for what it was. A test of how alone, and how frightened she might be made to feel, and she was grateful, not for the first time, for the particular courage of a dog who had decided long ago that she was his to protect. Her uncle Silas, to her surprise, arrived at the station a few days later, not on Grant's business exactly, but drawn by rumors that had begun circulating that his niece had found something valuable, and his gentle voice returned in full force, urging her to sell the station and come back where she belonged. An offer that fooled Clara not at all, since his sudden interest in her welfare had clearly been prompted by his own mortgage, which Clara had by then learned was held, like nearly every mortgage in Sable Creek, by Elias Grant. When Clara refused, calmly and without anger, to hand over either the station or the papers she had found within it, Silas's mask slipped just enough for her to see, plainly, that he had known more than he'd ever admitted about how the farm's finances had been arranged in the years after her father's death, and that his eagerness to see her gone from Sable Creek altogether was not incidental to Grant's own comfort. He reminded her, with a coldness that finally matched the truth of him, that a young woman alone with no family standing behind her would find little sympathy in town if her claims against a man like Grant came to nothing, and that she would do well to consider how thin the ice really was beneath her before she went further. Copper, watching this exchange from beneath the desk, never once let his eyes leave Silas's hands, and when the man rose to go, the dog rose too, placing himself squarely in the doorway, until Silas had no choice but to step around him, an indignity Clara suspected her uncle would not soon forgive, but that she found, privately, deeply satisfying. She found she trusted that watchfulness more than she trusted a single word her uncle spoke, and long after his wagon had rattled off down the road, she sat with her hand resting on Copper's head, steadying herself against a fear she had not let herself feel, while Silas was still in the room. In the days that followed, Clara found herself waking earlier than she needed to, listening for wagon wheels on the road long before any appeared, and she noticed that Copper's habits had changed as well, that he had taken to sleeping nearer the door than he used to, ears tilting toward the smallest sounds of the night. She understood, without either of them ever needing to say it in words a person could speak, that they had entered into a kind of vigil together, two creatures who had already lost everything once, and did not intend to be caught unprepared a second time. It was during one of these wakeful nights that Clara finally finished the last of her father's coded entries, decoding a final passage in which Thomas Mabry, in his own careful hand, had written that he intended to take his findings to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, once he had gathered a little more proof, a plan the fever had stolen from him, before he ever set out. Reading those words by lamplight, with Copper's steady breathing the only other sound in the room, Clara understood that she was not simply defending herself or her station any longer. She was finishing a task her father had run out of time to complete, and the thought settled something in her, a resolve that no amount of intimidation from Silas or Grant's men could fully unsettle again. The turning point came on a night in late June, when Clara woke to Copper's frantic barking, and the unmistakable smell of coal oil drifting through the station's cracked windows. She found, upon hurrying outside with a lantern, that someone had attempted to set fire to the old platform overhang, a clumsy, half-hearted arson that had failed to catch properly, thanks to a damp night, and, Clara suspected, the barking that had likely startled whoever set it before the job was finished. It was Copper who had woken her in time, Copper whose nose had caught the coal oil before flame had fully taken, and Clara stood in the yard in her nightdress, shaking with a fear that had finally, fully arrived, understanding that whatever her father had uncovered was dangerous enough that someone was willing to burn the evidence, and her along with it, rather than see it exposed. It was in that moment, staring at the scorch marks on her father's old platform, that Clara Mabry decided she would no longer wait to be certain enough, safe enough, or brave enough. She would take what she had to the one place in Sable Creek where it could not be quietly buried, the town itself. Sable Creek held its Founders' Day gathering every July at the town square, a tradition begun in the years right after the fire as a way of remembering what had been lost, and celebrating what had been rebuilt, and it was, Clara knew, the one occasion each year when nearly every family in town gathered in the same place at the same time, including, always, Elias Grant, who used the event to remind the town of his generosity with a short speech from the bandstand steps. Clara arrived that July afternoon, with her father's journal, the ledgers from the strongbox, and a folder of corroborating courthouse records she had spent weeks assembling, Copper walking at her heel, with the same steady, watchful bearing he had carried through every strange night of the past 2 months. She waited until Grant had finished his customary remarks, until the applause had faded, and the crowd's attention had begun to drift toward the food tables, and then she climbed the bandstand steps herself, her heart hammering, and asked, in a voice that carried further than she expected, whether the town might spare a few more minutes to hear something that concerned them all. What followed was not a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation, because Clara had learned from her father that truth delivered calmly carries further than truth delivered in anger. She read aloud, plainly, the dates and figures from her father's journal, explained the discrepancy between what had been wired to Sable Creek after the fire, and what had ever reached a single burned family, and laid out, name by name, the land parcels and account transfers that traced the missing $4,000 back to Elias Grant. She named families in the crowd, the Odells, the Petersons, the Vasquez family, who had lost everything in that fire, and rebuilt on borrowed money and grit, money that should never have needed borrowing at all, had the relief funds meant for them ever arrived. Grant, standing near the bandstand, first laughed the accusation off, as the fantasy of a grieving girl, then grew visibly pale as Clara produced, one by one, the courthouse records that corroborated her father's private notations. Records that showed land purchases in Grant's name completed within weeks of relief funds vanishing from the bank's public ledger. It was Copper, sitting alert and unmoving at the foot of the bandstand steps throughout the entire reading, who drew several onlookers' eyes toward Grant when the banker, in a moment of panic, moved as though to push through the crowd and leave, the dog rising and stepping deliberately into his path, with a low, warning growl that made the intent to flee unmistakable to everyone watching. The town marshal, present as he was every Founder's Day, took Grant into custody that same afternoon, on the strength of evidence that could no longer be dismissed as one grieving girl's fancy, and the territorial circuit judge, arriving the following month to review the courthouse's corroborating records, found more than enough cause to freeze Grant's assets and open a formal inquiry into 3 years of quietly falsified ledgers. The relief money itself, or what remained recoverable of it once the banker's landholdings were liquidated under court order, was returned that autumn to the families who should have received it years before, the Odells finally able to rebuild the barn they'd been patching together with borrowed lumber, the Petersons paying off the last of a mortgage that never should have existed at all. Silas Mabry, questioned by the circuit judge about his own knowledge of Grant's dealings, found his gentle reputation in Sable Creek permanently tarnished. His mortgage called due in full once Grant's bank was placed under new management, and he left the territory that winter with considerably less than he had schemed to gain. A quiet kind of justice that Clara took no pleasure in, but did not mourn either. Clara herself asked for nothing beyond the return of what was rightfully owed to others, refusing even the reward the grateful town council tried to press upon her, though she did accept, at the insistence of the Odells and the Petersons and a dozen other families, help enough to properly restore Bitterroot Station's roof and windows before the following winter set in. The old depot became, in time, something between a museum and a meeting hall, the place where Clara taught telegraphy to any child in Sable Creek curious enough to learn it, her father's key clicking again beneath young hands, the way it once had beneath her own, and Copper spent his afternoons stretched in a patch of sunlight on the platform, greeting every new pupil with the same unhurried dignity he had carried through every dark night of that difficult spring. It is worth remembering, in the end, that a girl cast out with $11 to her name once stood before a crowd who expected nothing of her, and bought, for 4 of those dollars, a ruin that everyone else had already decided was worthless. It is worth remembering that the wrong done to her, and the far larger wrong done to her whole town, had both been hiding in plain sight for years, waiting only for someone patient enough to listen the way her father always said mattered more than talking. And it is worth remembering that the thing which finally cracked that silence open was not cleverness or luck, but a dog's simple stubborn love, a nose pressed against a seam in the wall, because something there mattered to the person he'd decided, long ago, to protect. Overlooked things, an old station, a cast-out girl, a faithful dog nobody thought to ask twice about, turned out to hold, between them, everything Sable Creek needed to set itself right again. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and with Clara and Copper, out on the quiet Wyoming grassland, where an abandoned station once waited patiently to be found. If their story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things are rarely worthless things. And before you go, we'll leave you with this to sit with. What is it in your own life that everyone else has already decided isn't worth a second look, and what might happen if you looked anyway? Until next time, stay close.